The man was tall, with long hair, blue eyes, and a thin mouth. Is that a nice description? I guess it depends on who you ask. Personally, I do think it's rather simple and prosaic, although I've come to appreciate that sort of thing over time. The general advice you'll hear when it comes to introducing characters is that you should always try to make your descriptions as dynamic as possible. So instead of writing something like, the girl got off the motorcycle, she wore a leather jacket and had long hair, you could keep the exact same scene and the exact same elements and instead describe it as, the girl got off the motorcycle, her leather jacket squeaking, her long hair whipping in the wind. I do think writing descriptions that are more dynamic will help most of the time, but I also think you need to be careful. You want a reader to get a good grasp of your character's appearance as soon as they're introduced. And if we're talking about a minor character whose appearance matters because it's a clue to something, it's doubly important to be clear and not allow the description to be something your reader might just read past unthinkingly. And this is the main risk I see with dynamic descriptions, that the reader gets so swept up in what they're reading that they forget they're being described a character they have to visualize. And if things are moving so fast that they never get an opportunity to build a clear visualization, there's a strong chance that they'll just brush over the details altogether. If you're adding a dynamic description of a side character because it fits the vibe of your story and you're trying to set the tone, that's great. But if you're writing something like A Song of Ice and Fire where a single line of description might be a clue to an unnamed figure being a certain character or pretending to be someone else, then static clarity is going to be preferable to action-packed dynamism. The other thing with dynamic descriptions is that they work best if you've got an element or two that you really want to stress about somebody. Say you've got a character and you want to stress the fact that he's morbidly obese. In that case, sure, you can write a dynamic description. Describe him waddling down the street, the fat of his body bouncing and jiggling with every step, maybe even adding a mention of how the buttons of his shirt strain under the pressure of his gut. But now imagine this man is not morbidly obese, and only fat or chubby. Or that even if he is morbidly obese, you don't want to put a laser focus on that specific trait. What if you wanted to give a general description, with multiple key details that's as objective as possible and lets readers draw their own conclusion? Beyond him being overweight, we could mention that he's balding, has a scar under his left eye, wears coffee-stained blue jeans, heavy boots, and has a name tag pinned to his shirt. Not only would it take time to dynamically integrate all those elements in a general description, but it could be so lengthy that each particular detail gets lost before the reader conjures up a conclusive image of the character. Yes, it's true that just listing different physical traits of a character and what they're wearing can be unsophisticated and a bit dull, but at least it's brief, and it signals to the reader that you want them to slow down, take time, and visualize the character properly before they proceed. If I can speak for myself, I often pause when a main character is first described and really take my time trying to pick a mental image of what they look like before I continue. Some authors might argue that you shouldn't even be describing that many characters to begin with, and I have to agree with that to an extent. You should really stop and consider what trait stands out most about your character. Are they tiny? Are they bony, fat, bald, pale, gangly, beautiful, deformed? And even then, this stuff should be worth mentioning if it sets the tone in some way, or if it teaches us something about the character, or if it explains the behavior of other characters towards them. For example, if you introduce a character and she has a broken nose, that raises a lot of questions. Is she a battered wife? Is she an athlete? Did she get into a big fight? How'd that nose get broken? On the other hand, if you're writing about a black student going to an all-white school, knowing they have dark skin might be relevant in understanding why they're singled out or treated differently if they are. I'm going for more generic examples here to make it clear, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying with this. There's really no reason to get super in-depth with your character description unless it serves a specific purpose. If you happen to write a very long description of a character, ask yourself this: is it relevant to the plot? Is it deepening my reader's understanding of the character and how others treat them? Is it at least setting the tone and mood in some way? Because if it's not one of those, and ideally it should be all of them, then you're probably saying way too much for no reason. Generally, I'd recommend you narrow down your character's appearance to 2 or 3 important physical traits and leave it at that. And don't feel the need to use dynamic descriptions just because they generally sound better. Sometimes simplicity is good, especially if what you're saying is going to take the reader by surprise. Imagine, for example, that you start a story by describing the entrance to a cave and how a manly man is screaming and echoing from within. You describe his booming voice and his ferocious attitude. But then, when he finally emerges, you keep your description simple. He was small and short. That's really all you need in that situation, since the simplicity of that description is exactly what makes it so impactful. It creates a nice contrast with what came before. One thing you can accomplish with dynamic descriptions, though, is giving a feel of the character without directly mentioning their personality. For example, let's say we're describing a blonde princess. How could we do that? A simple description might be, she was a princess with blonde hair. Or, even simpler, she had blonde hair. But could we make that more dynamic? Sure. We could imagine her getting out of a carriage and write, she emerged from the carriage, her long hair trailing behind her. Here, even though we made the description more dynamic, we still didn't really give a feel of her personality. Could we do that? She emerged from the carriage with meticulous care, shielding the blonde bun heaped atop her head from the winds with the immense torso of her knight. In this one, we get the impression that the princess is careful, methodical, and perhaps a bit vain. At the end of the day, you're going to have to develop a feeling for when to use what type of description based on the rhythm of your story and what's required. What I would stress above all else is that you communicate very clearly what your character looks like very early on. And by very early on, I mean literally the first page. You don't want to give the reader an opportunity to come up with an image for the character and then try to overwrite it. You want to be there first. You want to tell them what the character looks like. And keep in mind, readers can and will reject details of your description if you add it too late. And I speak here as a reader myself. If you give me a description on page 1, and you mention your character has brown hair and bright green eyes, but fail to mention that she has short hair until a dynamic description pops up on page 8, sorry, I've already imagined that character in one way, and that's not going to change. In theory, I might remember she's supposed to have short hair, but in my mind, she's going to remain long-haired. And, of course, it goes without saying, readers will imagine what they want to anyway. If you describe a male romantic interest as being dark-haired and having a sweet smile, the man readers will come up with will resemble men they know and like, and not the one you were picturing when writing that description. You can't control this, so don't even try. The only thing we all need to agree on as readers is that he's indeed dark-haired and has a sweet smile, since that pertains to the story itself. Our visualized, personally directed experience of the story does not. I legitimately think that the reason so many descriptions suck so much is because the person writing them is not really thinking in writing terms and isn't prioritizing storytelling. By which I mean that they aren't describing a character from their story per se, so much as describing an actor they have a crush on as that character. It isn't necessarily that these people are bad writers, since they'd be perfectly capable of describing a character they aren't emotionally invested in the right way. The real issue is that they clearly have an unhealthy fixation with some celebrity, and that's making its way into their writing. You have to accept the fact that you have very little control over how people will imagine your characters. In some cases, they might actively rewrite your description in their heads and just imagine what they want. Here's the thing you really need to internalize. Artists and filmmakers offer people what they themselves have imagined. That is rarely what you're doing as a writer. Your job, on the contrary, is instructing people on what and how to imagine. This is a key difference you always need to remember. An artist holds up a painting to someone and she goes, "Here it is. You like it? You don't like it? I don't really care. That's the painting." This isn't true for authors. As an author, you're a guide. You have a responsibility. You have to use language to help others imagine things you've already experienced in your own mind. You can tell them what you've seen, but you can't make them see it. You can only help them imagine for themselves. And no amount of brute force is going to smuggle in a crystal clear image you have in your head into theirs. It doesn't matter how detailed your prose is, it just doesn't work that way. The more insistent you are on the details, the more you will lose them and their attention. And it's not just that it's bad writing, it's condescending and annoying. I want to read a story to imagine cool stuff myself. I don't want to read something so another person will painstakingly describe every frame of the movie they'll never make. My last piece of advice on this topic is this. Let go of your ego and focus less on describing things as you see them in your mind, and more on the essentials the reader needs to imagine things on their own.